Happy Friday, everyone. It looks like we are live. Thank you for joining us. I would say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Adriano Bossoni. I am Director of Analysis at RANE, and I am joined here with by my colleague Carmen Colosi. She is our leading Latin American analyst. And we are about to talk about something that is quite important that is happening on Sunday, which is the second round of the presidential election in Brazil. It's been a very, very heated um, campaign. There was closer than expected results in the first round between the two main candidates. So, Carmen, why don't you explain to us how we got here, who the main contenders are, and what we are looking for on Sunday?
Great. So this election is kind of really classified by the current president, by Jair Bolsonaro, and his ideological opposite, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is a two-time president of the 2000s. So these two candidates are quite opposite. Bolsonaro is very kind of right-leaning, conservative on the surface, and Lula is quite kind of leftist on the surface. They do have some overlap when it comes to policy, specifically on things like spending and so on and so forth. But ideologically, the way that they're presented in Brazil is being quite opposite to one another. So this election was really classified by Lula kind of being ahead by anywhere from 10 to 15 points in the polls for the majority of the kind of election, kind of run up to the election. And what we saw on the October 2nd first round of the presidential election is that Bolsonaro did a lot better than even the polls kind of predicted that he would. So we saw polls saying that there would be a 10 to 14 point difference, and there was actually a 5-point difference. So quite a jump there. And as we've seen the polls, which now have questionable reliability, they've actually predicted that there's even a smaller margin, which is around 4%.
So this is why Bolsonaro, whom, let's be clear, according to opinion polls, should, in theory, if the polls are correct, be defeated on Sunday. This is why what is motivating him to say that the system is rigged against him, that the elections are unfair, that the electoral committee is not impartial. So he's basically questioning the results on Sunday, right?
Yes, exactly. So he's questioning the reliability of specifically the Superior Electoral Court.
Okay.
So we've seen this over the course of this past week. He's really kind of called into question some electoral tactics, specifically concerning radio time, and saying that his opponent Lula gets more radio time in a certain, area of the country. But it's really a lot broader than that, kind of saying that to his followers in a big way, that the electoral courts cannot be trusted, that the Supreme Court cannot be trusted, and that these kind of major Brazilian institutions are not trustworthy when it comes to the results of the election. So this kind of rhetoric building up ahead of the election on Sunday is particularly concerning for analysts here at RANE, kind of when we're trying to forecast what's going to happen. And that is really kind of what we're looking at in terms of different scenarios and in terms of a scenario where we could see the results on Sunday being contested.
So let's assume that opinion polls are correct, and on Sunday, former President Lula da Silva wins by, let's say, 2, 3, 4 points. Will Bolsonaro quietly concede and go home, or will he contest those results?
So all indications that we've seen thus far have kind of led us to believe that the most likely scenario is that he will contest the result, especially if the margin is very small. So a big portion of that is that there is a kind of large dissemination of fake news and disinformation in Brazil that is very kind of right-leaning and right-heavy. And so there is a large portion of the population that does believe a lot of the things that are kind of being put out there against both the Lula administration or Lula campaign, rather, and also the judiciary and the kind of judicial sector of the government. So both of those things have kind of led to a scenario in which it would be very easy for Bolsonaro to contest the election results and kind of appeal to these sentiments that are already there in Brazilian society. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that even if Bolsonaro does not formally contest the election results, we're likely to still see a moderate amount of right-wing protests against Lula's win on Sunday, if he does win, specifically because of this kind of dissemination of fake news.
Okay, that's super interesting. And this is a conversation that we at RANE are having internally pretty much every day, because contesting the election could mean lots of very different things with very different implications, right? He could simply go to court and say the entire process was irregular or illegal. We need a recount, or we need another election, or whatever, which would be, just to give it a name, like the legal path to contest the election. He could himself ask his followers to actually take to the streets, make a lot of noise, potentially block roads, set things on fire. Or, as you were saying, he could not directly order his followers to do these things, but his followers could do it regardless, right? So we are looking at a very different scenarios and very different ways in which he could contest the results, right?
Yes, exactly. And each different way that he could contest the results has its own implications, specifically concerning political polarization in Brazil over the course of the next 4 years. So, no matter who comes out the winner of the election on Sunday, and no matter what we see, we're very likely going to see polarization in Brazil, reach all-time highs. However, if we do see Bolsonaro contesting the election results, and if he's, asking his supporters to go to the streets, that's something that we could see, be repeated over the course of the next 4 years. We could see issues for Lula to create coalitions in Congress and all of these things. And it really matters on the intensity with which Bolsonaro could potentially contest the election results. And that will really kind of show us where Brazil is headed for the next 4 years, if it will be complete political kind of stagnation due to a high degree of polarization, or if there's some room for kind of conciliation on certain issues.
So I know that opinion polls kind of got it wrong, in the sense that they exaggerated, or they thought that Lula would win the first round by a wider margin, and it proved to be narrower than expected. If, just for argument's sake, I know that this is not what polls are saying right now, but let's assume that Bolsonaro actually wins the election on Sunday. Do you think that Lula supporters will also protest the results, considering that they've been ahead in the polls for months now?
Very likely we'll see, we would see in that scenario Lula supporters coming out to the streets and protesting another 4 years of Bolsonaro. Lula himself has indicated that he would be willing to accept the election results regardless. But I do think that there is, a potential scenario where Lula is questioning the election results if he loses. But, he has already committed to accepting whatever results there is. So the likelihood of that scenario is a lot lower than it would be for Bolsonaro.
That's super interesting. And regardless of who wins, I would guess that the next Brazilian president faces significant challenges, right? At a time that the global economy is slowing down, at a time that inflation, energy prices are a problem everywhere on earth. What are the main challenges that the next president will have to face, regardless of who wins the election on Sunday?
Yeah, so some main challenges are going to be enticing investors into Brazil. Brazil has seen investors really across industries kind of put new investments and new projects on hold for fear of this kind of political stagnation, political polarization, and also just concerns about the Brazilian economy. So that's one. The second is that we'll see the new president, whoever that is, kind of have to face off high inflation. So especially as we see food prices rising, and potentially if oil and other fuel prices take another rise, that's a scenario in which we could see the Brazilian president kind of facing inflationary pressures. Adriano, I'd like to kick this off to you a little bit because obviously we've been talking internally about the Brazil-EU trade deal and how, it's been a decade in the making at this point, but there's not been a lot of progress. Do you see that there is a potential that if a new president, if potentially Lula comes into office, that could be something that could really facilitate the EU-Mercosur trade deal?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carmen. We need to keep in mind that the EU-Mercosur agreement is currently frozen, even though there has been some movement in recent weeks. But just to make a long story short, we can safely say that it's frozen. There is a political agreement, but it has yet to be ratified and implemented. So the agreement exists, but it's not operative yet. And on the surface, the Europeans are saying that this is primarily because of Bolsonaro's deforestation in the Amazon rainforest and because of environmental concerns about everything that the Bolsonaro administration has been doing in recent years. That's the official argument, I would say. But if we look at domestic politics in countries like France, Ireland, Poland, which are all countries with very large agricultural sectors, they are worried about an EU-Mercosur agreement opening the EU market to super competitive food exports from the likes of Brazil and Argentina. So in theory, the official position from the EU is that a Bolsonaro administration, especially if it's more environmentally friendly than a Lula administration, especially if it's more environmentally friendly than a Bolsonaro administration, would be closer to a deal because of better environmental protections. I would say that at least from the European point of view, this idea of opening EU markets to super competitive food exports from Brazil and Argentina will continue to be very controversial. So I am not particularly optimistic about the implementation of the deal. And from the Mercosur point of view, that's another interesting perspective, because the Lula administration may not be particularly interested in lifting protectionist measures, opening up the economy, especially if they have to negotiate with the Argentinian government, which, as we know, is quite protectionist, at least until the next presidential election in Argentina in October 2023. So I would say in the short term, I do not expect the EU-Mercosur agreement to make any progress, regardless of the outcome of the election. Of course, a Lula administration should, in theory, be well received in Europe, especially by fellow center-left governments. He's seen as a more friendly face, if you like, than the Bolsonaro administration. But I sincerely don't expect any breakthroughs in the bilateral FTA negotiations.
Yeah, that's great insight. I just want to touch on something that you brought up, which is Argentina and Brazil relations. Obviously, as an Argentine yourself, who better to talk to this issue? So, if we do see a Lula administration come into power, is that something that we could see tensions between Argentina and Brazil which has been existent over the course of the past 4 years of Bolsonaro, kind of ease? Is that something where we could see potentially Brazil and Argentina collaborate more? And if so, in what ways do you think that we could see that?
So the Argentinian government is actually heavily invested in the electoral campaign in Brazil. They've been openly campaigning in favor of Lula. We have seen very senior figures in the Argentinian government openly supporting Lula and openly campaigning for Lula. We know that the relationship between Argentina and Brazil was quite cold when the Bolsonaro administration is in power and the left-wing government in Argentina is in power. They are ideologically very far apart, so that the relationship these days is quite cold.
Yeah.
The Argentinian government really wants Lula to win the election, which means that if Bolsonaro wins, I think that relations will remain cold, at least until the Argentinian election in October. If Lula wins, I would expect a rapprochement. That rapprochement will primarily be political, I would say. There will be greater alignment on regional issues like the Organization of American States and Mercosur and the other political institutions that exist in South America. Relations with Venezuela and other like-minded countries could improve, and there could be more alignment in that regard. Commercial issues, I would say, trade issues will remain problematic because Mercosur is an extremely deeply flawed customs union, and there's a lot of problems that result from the fact that the Brazilian economy is so much bigger than the Argentinian economy. So there's a lot of internal quotas and internal exemptions and unresolved issues. So I do expect significant political alignment if Lula wins the election. Trade conversations, economic conversations will continue to be problematic, I think.
Yeah, that's fabulous insight.
So I'm afraid this is all we have time for. It's been great talking with you, Carmen. I know that you've been covering the Brazilian election for many months now, and there's even more coverage to come. We have a great scenario analysis with the multiple outcomes of the election. There's a lot of coverage coming to our website. So thanks for all your hard work on this topic. And for people watching us, if you like what you saw and what you heard, you can find more of Carmen's work at our RANE website. And thank you so much for joining us, and see you all next week.
Thank you, everybody.